Imagine this. Tomorrow morning, someone transfers 10 crore rupees into your bank account. No exams, no financial stress, no worrying about college fees, no checking restaurant prices before ordering. Just 10 crore rupees. Now, here's the real question. Would you automatically become happier? Most people instantly say yes. But what if I told you economists, psychologists, and statisticians have spent decades trying to answer the exact question? And the answer is far more complicated than you think. Welcome back to Pie and the Pound. I'm Kavya, and today we are exploring one of the most fascinating questions in behavioral economics. Can money buy happiness? Or maybe the better question is, how much happiness can money actually buy before it stops working? To help me unpack this, I'm joined by someone who lives at the intersection of numbers and people, Miss Anshu Rai. Anshu is a humanities with mathematics student, a public policy and economics enthusiast, head girl, president, zonal interact representative for RID 3011. On the quantitative side, she is a gold medalist in the Mathematics Olympiad, ranked All India Rank 8 in the National Economics Olympiad 2025 by Sri Ram College of Commerce, and grabbed AIR 103 in the National Finance Olympiad. And someone who somehow manages to make economics sound exciting. Welcome to the show, Anshu.
Thank you so much, Kavya, for such an amazing introduction. And honestly, I love this topic because it challenges one of the biggest cliches we have all grown up hearing. Every school essay told us money can't buy happiness. But in the real world, the relationship between capital and subjective well being is an actively debated paradox in economics. And today, we are throwing out the cliche.
Exactly. And instead of relying on motivational quotes from Instagram, we are going to rely on data. We are anchoring today's discussion on a paper by Samat Junjunwala titled The Correlation of Money and Happiness, published in Artha 2024, the Shriram Economics Journal. The paper argues something surprisingly balanced. Money and happiness are positively correlated, but only to a certain extent. And that extent is actually where things get interesting. So, now let's start with the most basic question. If I earn more money next year than I do today, will I become happier? What does traditional research say about the absolute limits of money buying happiness?
Generally, yes. Economics and psychology research consistently shows that increasing income tends to increase happiness. But here's the catch, the increase isn't unlimited. Researchers found something called a satiation point, a level of income after which additional money contributes very little happiness. One influential study associated with Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman suggested this threshold sits around $1 lakh dollars annually, though inflation and geography can shift the number.
Okay, so if we write it mathematically, given that wealth equals to W and happiness equals to H, if W is below $100,000, then an increase in W leads to an increase in H. But if W is greater than $100,000, a rise in wealth leaves happiness completely indifferent, right? As W increases, H tends to flatline.
Exactly. Think about a student. If someone currently studies under poor conditions and suddenly gets access to books, internet, coaching, a good laptop, their quality life improves dramatically. But if that same student already has all those things, buying a fifth laptop probably won't transform their happiness. So, as once basic demands are met, the money stops functioning as a direct lever for subjective well being.
Yeah, that's such a good example. The first laptop changes your life, and the fifth laptop becomes a storage problem.
Precisely, the first purchase solves the problem, and the later purchases simply add options. And solving problems create much more happiness than adding options.
So far, we've established something important. Money does increase happiness, but not infinitely. The obvious question now is why? What is it about human nature that causes the relationship between wealth and happiness to weaken over time? And that's exactly what psychologists have been trying to explain for decades. One of the most famous explanations comes from Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Could you break it down for our viewers?
Sure, Maslow divides human needs into five levels. At the bottom are physiological needs like food and water, also known as deficiency needs. Then safety, then belonging, then esteem, and then finally self actualization. Money is extremely effective at satisfying the lower layers. Suppose if you're hungry, money buys you food. If you're worried about rent, money buys security. If you're struggling with healthcare, money provides access.
So, money is almost like a universal problem solving tool at the bottom of the pyramid, right?
Yes, exactly. But as you move up the pyramid to the growth needs, just as esteem and self actualization, money loses its purchasing power. You can't order self respect on Amazon. You can't subscribe to Purpose using a monthly payment plan. And you definitely can't buy genuine friendships by swiping a credit card. At those higher levels, happiness depends upon factors that money can support but cannot directly purchase.
Yeah, precisely. The marginal happiness you get from buying necessities is drastically greater than what you get from comforts, which is greater than what you get from luxuries. Your happiness is technically still increasing across these stages, but at a severely decreasing rate. Okay, interesting. This brings us to a slightly different model analyzed in the essay, the fulfillment curve introduced by Joe Dominguez and Vicky Robin. This model maps money spent on the x axis and fulfillment on the y axis across three distinct stages: survival, comforts, and extravagance. And honestly, this one feels very relatable.
Absolutely. The model divides spending into three stages: survival, comfort, and extravagance. In the survival and comfort stages, every additional unit of money spent raises your total utility or TU. Your marginal utility is positive, so your fulfillment goes up, but then you hit what the model calls the enough point.
Hmm. The absolute maximum of the total utility curve. And here is where it deviates from the Maslow analysis. Maslow suggests that past a certain point, money and happiness are just indifferent to each other. The fulfillment curve takes a sharper turn. It argues that if you push past the enough point into the extravagance stage, your marginal utility actually becomes negative. Total utility actively declines, which sounds incredibly rare in today's world, right? Because social media constantly tells us that whatever we have is never enough.
Exactly. You buy a phone, then someone else buys a better phone like iPhone. You buy a car, someone else has a luxury SUV. You get into your dream college. Suddenly everyone's talking about another college. Then goalposts keep moving like that.
This is so true. It's like running on a treadmill that keeps increasing its speed.
Exactly. You gain possessions but lose peace of mind. You gain status and symbols, but stress, comparison, and anxiety comes with the offer of buy two and get three free, like an irony.
100%. I love this point because it perfectly aligns with game theory. If everyone in your social circle starts buying luxury assets to signal status, You have to buy one just to maintain your current social standing. It's a zero sum game. You aren't gaining utility, you are just spending capital to avoid a social.
Yes, it's basically an arms race, except instead of weapons, everyone's competing with watches, cars, handbags, and Instagram stories. Economists call this positional competition. The reward isn't the product itself, it's being slightly ahead of everyone else. And that's a race with no finish line.
Let's zoom out and move from individual consumer utility to the macroeconomic level. If money buys happiness up to the satiation point for an individual, does a higher GDP per capita guarantee a happier country?
Great question. So, initially, yes. If you look at global indices, high income countries like Norway or the US report much higher average life satisfaction than low income countries like Niger or Burundi. It's actually why the King of Bhutan introduced Gross National Happiness or GNH in the 1970s. They recognized that economic growth alone wasn't telling the whole story.
Yeah, so true. Let's take the United States as an example. Over the second half of the 20th century, the American economy experienced remarkable growth. Incomes rose, consumption increased, and living standards improved dramatically. So, naturally, you'd expect Americans to become significantly happier over time, right? Well, that's where things get interesting. When economist Richard Easterlin examined the data, he found that average happiness levels hadn't risen nearly as much as the economy had. This puzzling observation eventually became known as the Easterlin paradox. So, Anshu, if a country keeps getting richer, why doesn't its happiness seem to keep pace?
Because the Easterlin paradox suggests that beyond a certain point, economic growth alone doesn't guarantee higher levels of happiness. In the early stages of development, a rise in GDP per capita improves access to essentials like food, healthcare, education, housing, etc. So happiness rises alongside income. But once a nation reaches a collective satiation point, the equation changes. People stop evaluating their well being based on their absolute wealth or how much richer they are than before and start comparing themselves to others. So, in other words, or in a nutshell, the focus shifts from am I better off than I was yesterday to am I better off than the people around me? So even as the economy grows and incomes rises, average happiness may remain relatively unchanged. That's precisely the puzzle Richard Easterlin observed in the United States.
Okay. And that naturally brings us to inequality. Imagine two countries with the same GDP per capita. On paper, they might look equally prosperous. But if in one country wealth is shared relatively evenly, while in the other it's concentrated in the hands of a small elite, the lived experience of the average citizen will be completely different.
Exactly. Averages can be deceptive. That's why economists can't rely solely on GDP per capita. They need a way to measure how evenly income is distributed across society, and that's where the Gini coefficient comes in. The Gini coefficient measures income inequality on a scale of 0 to 1. The value closer to 0 indicates greater equality, while a value closer to 1 indicates greater inequality. What's fascinating is that the data cited in Samarth's essay shows a clear pattern. As the Gini coefficient rises, gross national happiness tends to fall. In other words, it's not just how much wealth a society creates that matters, it's how that wealth is distributed. A growing economic pie means little if most people feel they are getting a smaller and smaller slice of it, which reduces overall well being.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. So now let's bring this down to a decision many students listening today will eventually face. Imagine two jobs. Job A pays more, job B pays less, but it feels meaningful. What happens? A Harvard Business Review study surveyed over 2,200 professionals. Over 90% said they would willingly sacrifice part of their future income for more meaningful work. Which sounds shocking at first, right?
Wait. Until you realize many respondents had already crossed the survival threshold. The problem wasn't insufficient income, the problem was finding purpose. And we have already discussed that purpose operates much higher on Maslow's pyramid than salary. But if you ask a worker struggling to pay for basic groceries, if they want to trade income for meaning, they are going to optimize for the cash. They have to.
Right. That 90% statistic exists because those specific professionals have already bypassed their deficiency needs. They've crossed the satiation point where money and happiness are indifferent to each other because they aren't fighting for survival. They place a higher value on meaning and self actualization than on marginal income growth. Hmm. This isn't just an economics problem anymore, I think. It's a leadership problem, in my opinion. Whether you're running a country, a company, or even a student organization, resources are always limited. So here's the challenge now. How do you decide whether success means generating more money or creating a community where people genuinely feel fulfilled? Unsure, you've worked in leadership spaces through Interact and explored economic decision making through competitions like the Sri Ram College of Commerce National Economics Olympiad. What's the biggest lesson this research offers policymakers, in your opinion?
So, the biggest lesson is that a budget and a balance sheet can tell you how a community is performing, but not necessarily how it's feeling. Economics often teaches us to optimize, maximize income, maximize growth, maximize output. And those goals are absolutely essential in the survival and comfort stages. But once basic economic security is achieved, simply chasing bigger numbers isn't enough. At that point, good policy has to ask a different question. What are we optimizing now? That's where concepts like the Gini coefficient, social cohesion, opportunity, and purpose become important. Because beyond a certain threshold, progress isn't just about creating more wealth, it's about creating a society where that wealth translates into well being.
Yeah, I love that distinction. It's almost like climbing a ladder. In the beginning, your goal is to climb as fast as possible. But eventually, you have to stop and ask whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. That's exactly what the fulfillment curve tells us. During the survival and comfort stages, maximizing income increases utility. But if individuals or governments keep chasing wealth long after reaching the enough point, they risk entering the extravagance stage where marginal utility begins to decline. Sometimes, sometimes I think the smart decision isn't to keep climbing, it's to redefine what success looks like. So, after such a long discussion of economics, psychology, statistics, and behavioral science, what's the verdict? Can money actually buy happiness?
Yes, but only partially. Money is incredibly effective at reducing misery. It can buy security, comfort, opportunity, healthcare, education, freedom from many daily worries. But beyond a certain point, happiness depends less on income and more on relationships, purpose, meaning, community, and equality.
And that's perhaps the most important takeaway. Money matters far more than many cliches suggest. But it isn't the final destination, it's the vehicle. And confusing the vehicle for the destination is where many people get lost. Thank you so much for joining me today, Anshu.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me. It was great having a conversation on such an interesting topic. Thank you,
Yes.
Kavya.
Yes, so true. And to everyone listening, earn enough to live well, but don't spend your entire life chasing a number that keeps moving further away. This has been Pie in the Pound. See you next time.